One of the biggest myths about the Israel-Palestine conflicts is that it's been going on for centuries. That is, this is all about ancient religious hatreds. In fact, while religion is involved, the conflict is mostly about two groups of people who claim the same land. And it really only goes back a century, to the early 1900s. Around then, the region along the eastern Mediterranean that we now call Israel had been under Ottoman rule for centuries. It was religiously diverse, including mostly Muslims and Christians, but also a small number of Jews, who generally lived in peace. And it was changing in two important ways. My guest today is Professor Shai Feldman, one of the world's leading scholars of Middle Eastern politics and security. He is the Raymond Frankel Chair in Israeli Politics and Society at Brandeis University, the founding director of the Crown Center for Middle East Studies, and former president of Sapir Academic College, and one of the foremost experts on the Arab-Israeli conflict. Professor Feldman has spent decades studying war, peace, diplomacy, nuclear deterrence, and the decisions that shape the Middle East. So today I want to ask him the question that may determine the future of the region. Can Israelis and Palestinians still find a way out, or has the window for peace already closed? Professor Feldman, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
So, Professor Shai, you've spent decades studying this conflict, so let's start with the biggest question of all. What is Zionism?
Well, Zionism is the national movement of the Jewish people. Zionism, in the same way that Arab nationalism, are basically the result of the rise of nationalism in Europe in the 19th century. So as national movements took the stage in various locations in Europe, they affected the peoples of the Middle East and especially the Jewish people. And the reason that I say especially the Jewish people is because one of the negative side effects of the rise of nationalism in Europe, and particularly in Eastern Europe, is the fact that it was associated also with anti-Semitism. In the end, Zionism was given birth by anti-Semitism, by the search of Jews to find a solution to this problem of anti-Semitism, and also, by the way, the conclusion of many Jews that the efforts to address anti-Semitism by previous efforts, formulas, let's call it this way, of, for example, emancipation, and the effort to include Jews in the peoples where they resided in Europe, have failed. So the famous and direct connection had to do with a trial of a French Jewish military officer.
Yes.
By the name of Dreyfus.
The Dreyfus Affair.
Exactly, and the Dreyfus Affair was essentially an attempt to accuse that officer of the French military, Dreyfus, and to some extent his trial, and no one could say that he or she made a bigger effort to actually integrate into the society. I mean, what could be a more let's say robust effort to integrate it into the society than to serve in the military? And he served in the military, and he became an officer, and he rose in the French military, and so on and so forth, and yet was accused to what he was accused. And it was an Austrian Jewish journalist who attended the trial, Theodor Herzl, who again was personally affected strongly by this, by what he discovered, what he observed in this trial, and essentially led him to put together in book form the quest for Jewish nationalism, namely Zionism. He is the founding father, you could call it, of modern Jewish nationalism in the form of the book he wrote.
And when people use the word Zionism today, how does it differ from what its founder actually believed?
Well, I think that, first of all, the founder identified the problem in Europe and offered a recipe for dealing with this problem. But frankly, the founder knew very, very little about the Middle East. And so, it's very hard. Basically, his approach was, you could say, very idealistic. He believed, for example, that Jews can bring progress and science and so on from Europe and help the Middle East move forward. But Herzl was not cognizant of the other peoples who occupied this space called the Middle East, and certainly didn't enter in any depth what the possible conflicts could be between those who have already resided there, and so on and so forth. And he, and this is a period of. This is essentially the entail of the Ottoman period. And in a sense, the Middle East was a peaceful area because it was all part of the Ottoman Empire. And so the Ottomans kept the peace between the peoples, between the tribes, between, and so on and so forth. So to talk about the differences between Zionism of today and Zionism of the late 19th century, I mean, this is really worlds apart.
And why did it begin attracting support when it did, rather than like decades earlier, decades later? Why was it that specific period that Zionism grew?
I think the real reason is, again, it's the rise of nationalism in Europe. It's looking at nationalist movements in various locations in Eastern Europe. Not necessarily the large places like Russia, smaller places like Romania. Nationalism rose everywhere in Europe, and particularly in Eastern Europe during this part. And we have to remember that Jews were a very large percentage of the population of East European countries. I mean, in Poland itself, there were into the a few million people. So,
wow. Okay.
So they were heavily influenced by what they saw in Europe.
And why did Palestine become the preferred destination of this Jewish exodus instead of places like Argentina or Uganda?
Mostly because what connected the common denominator between Jews everywhere was the Bible. The location of where most of what the Bible refers to, addresses, takes place, is in the area where Jews finally settled, came to Palestine, the land of the 12 tribes, and even though Jews were very different from one another, they were very different from one another. For example, in the matter of language, Jews in Eastern Europe spoke Yiddish, which is a kind of a combination between German and other languages and so on. whereas Jews from the Arab world spoke Arabic. So Jews, let's say, who were in a place like Iraq, and Jews who were in a place like Poland, had no common language. What they did have common is that they were Jews, and therefore they attended to various degrees synagogue, and in the synagogue on a Friday or a Saturday they held the Bible. Okay, and as I said, it's where everything in the Bible takes place, is in the land to which they finally began to return in the late 19th century. And that's the reason. And that's the reason why the Bible could essentially, raise their imagination, raise their attraction. Whereas, and there were other recipes that were offered regarding other possible locations. At some point, the Zionist movement considered something called the Uganda Plan. But of course, it attracted a very small number of people, again, because there was nothing in Uganda could unite the Jewish people.
And like you were saying, in the late 19th century, there was this rise of nationalism. So at the same time, was there also a rise of nationalism in the region of Israel? Like, did they not see themselves as ethnic Arabs, but instead Palestinians?
No. Arab nationalism preceded the specific Palestinian nationalism.
Okay.
Arab nationalism, just like Zionism, was a product of the rise of nationalism in Europe. And it also had to do with the fact that one of, let's say, the most important developments in the history of, especially of the relationship between Europe and the Middle East, was Napoleon's invasion, first of Egypt and then Palestine and so on. Now, why is that so important? It's because what Napoleon basically brought the printed press to the Middle East.
The Arabic language press, yeah.
Well, eventually, but any printed press. So originally, before books could be printed, only a very, very small elite in the region would be able to have access to read the Quran. It was only that the printed press allowed, the printing of, thousands and thousands of copies of the Quran, that then became a common denominator in the Middle East. Because again, although actually the idea of nationalism, because it originates in Europe, actually is not the pioneers of Arab nationalism were not necessarily Muslims. There were actually, many of them were Christians, Christian missionaries, especially in areas of Lebanon and Syria, and so on and so forth. And again, because some of these missionaries came from countries, including the United States, that experienced already, struggles for independence, struggles for, and so on and so forth. They brought these ideas to where they were located, in places like Beirut and Damascus, and so on and so forth. But eventually, because larger numbers of a larger part of the population was attracted eventually to Islam, the fact that the printed press was available and allowed the printing of copies of the Quran gave essentially, it created the common denominator on the Arab side. And again, it was Arab nationalism. It didn't distinguish between, the various locations in the Middle East. And the reason for that is that the states as we know them, right, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Transjordan, all of these were not carved until the aftermath of the First World War. It was essentially
After
what
the Ottomans collapsed.
exactly the Ottomans collapsed, and the British and the French came, and all these borders were delineated by a senior French officer and a senior British officer, Sykes and Picot. And so these were, so by definition, there was no such thing as, let's say, Syrian nationalism or Lebanese nationalism. There's a question of whether there is Lebanese nationalism today, and Transjordan and so on and so forth. These could not come about, before borders were delineated between these locations.
And I just want to give a little context here. So, I want to kind of move into the actual establishment of the Jewish state. And obviously, a lot of the Zionist people and the Zionist movement, they were kind of immigrating in larger and larger numbers to Israel, right? And in Israel, they obviously had lots of tension with the native Arabs, be it Jews, Christians, or Muslims. So, how did the British immigration restrictions, how did they kind of reshape the Zionist movement? Did they make it, like, pacifiable?
Well, the British made the connection between the conflict and the immigration. And immigration means not only that people immigrated to Palestine, but also because, first of all, because people didn't just immigrate to Palestine. They came with certain ideas, and the ideas is Zionism, and again because Jews saw Zionism as a response to anti-Semitism, they had to essentially ask for themselves, what were the drivers of anti-Semitism in Europe. And one of the main, let's say, thought of the social democratic movement within Zionism was the fact that Jews were seen in Eastern Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, as the middlemen, as people who, let's say, bought the products of the Russian or East European peasant and went to the marketplace to sell the goods. In other words, Jews, and of course part of it is Jews were not allowed in many locations most locations to own land. And therefore Jews did not work the land. And therefore one of the pillars of social democratic Zionism was that Jews should work the land and work as hard as the Russian peasant and work as hard as the Arab peasant, and to essentially to liberate themselves from this notion of being the middleman, and so on and so forth. The problem with that, and that was called Hebrew labor. Now, the problem with Hebrew labor is that it found itself in competition with Arab labor. The willingness to work as hard as the Arab labor also was seen as a threat by Arabs who worked the land. So from the beginning, although the numbers were very, very small in the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, really and again, this is the connection again between Zionism and anti-Semitism. The numbers really, really began to be large with the rise of Nazism in Germany. Okay, and when Jewish communities in all of Europe began to see the rise of Nazism as a threat, okay, that caused more and more people in Europe to want to immigrate to Palestine. But this did not happen until the 1930s. So the 1910s and the 1920s, still the numbers were very, very small. It was only when the numbers really rose that Arabs began to resist, and the British had a problem, because that means that the British had to control violence. And so the British saw the connection between Jews returning to the land and the violence. and thought that they could deal with this by controlling immigration and controlling land purchases. That was part of their effort. But at the same time, they were also facing Arab nationalism, and they had to essentially, let's say, contain Arab nationalism. And because the Arab nationalism was directed both against the British, but also against the Zionists, the Jews, it actually created the basis of, to a certain extent, at least during that period of 1936, 1939, which is the period of the so-called Arab Revolt, it created actually an alliance. It pushed the British towards an alliance, a semi-alliance with the Zionists and vice versa.
Okay. And without the Holocaust, do you think Israel still would have been created?
It's very hard to say, because again, even though in the 1930s, which is before the Holocaust, the numbers, because of the fear of Nazi Germany, as I said, increased significantly. Whether that would have been enough to create the state is a very big question, because if you look at the deciding factor, the international legitimacy for creating the state of Israel, which is the UN, which was a new post-World War II invention, right? And you ask yourself, how was it that the majority of the countries, then members of the young United Nations, voted to create a Jewish state? In my view, it can't be separated from the Holocaust. I think the Holocaust was the deciding factor to essentially to accept the core of the Zionist narrative. That is to say that that the Jewish problem results from the fact that Jews comprised a minority everywhere, and that therefore, in one corner of the earth, wherever the corner of the earth is, Jews deserve to have some national entity in which they will comprise a majority. That's where essentially the idea of a Jewish state, which was, by the way, adopted by the Zionist movement only in 1942 in New York City, in a place called Biltmore Hotel. It's very difficult, again, to separate that from the threat that Nazi Germany presented. And of course, once the war was over and everybody realized the magnitude of the 6 million Jews that were slaughtered, then of course that gave the idea, the legitimacy, that international legitimacy that explains why there was a majority of world states voting to create the Jewish state on November 29, 1947.
And what do Americans misunderstand about Zionism or Jewish nationalism?
Well, it's not just Americans. There are competing narratives about and less about the original idea of what drove the idea called Zionism, but more fed by the manifestations, and you could call it the resistance to Zionism in the region. And the resistance produced wars in 1948 and 1956 and 1967. So in the end of the day, what we see now, let's say the last segment or chapter, is the attack on October 7 by Hamas against the communities in the southern part of Israel. Is just the latest chapter of a history of conflict that became violent in late 1947 and the beginning of 1948, and we are with this to this very day. And the conflict produced, first of all, in the region itself, competing narratives about what was the driver, why are we where we are, and the most important, let's say, division is between, again, Zionists who saw themselves establishing a national liberation movement. They saw it exactly in the same manner in which, let's say, the FLN became the national movement of Algeria, and sought to create Algeria from an area that was controlled until then by France. So for Jews, Zionism is a national liberation movement. The Arab population of the area saw the success of this national liberation movement, and with the success, and also with the resistance of the Arab state leaders, and then finally the Palestinians, to compromises. And we have to remember that, until President Sadat came to Egypt, to Israel in 1977, this was a period of an existential conflict between Arabs and Israelis, but a conflict in which Israel won repeated wars, if it's 48, 56, 67. Now, again, Israel saw this success as essentially confirming the strength of the Zionist narrative, of the Israeli narrative. Arabs saw the same development and read in it essentially a propensity for expansion. Now, that of course so Arabs saw Zionism as an existential threat to them. And again, during those first decades, this is the existential phase of the conflict. Both sides saw this conflict as existential. And it only begins to change, again, with President Sadat reaching the conclusion that, first of all, accepting the basic idea that actually the reason why Israel is expanding, and nobody disputed the fact that physically Israel expanded. President Sadat was the first Arab leader who adopted the notion that Israelis are fighting for their security, and of course he was a strong Egyptian, Arab, nationalist, patriot, and so on and so forth. So for him, the fact that after 1967 Israel occupied the Sinai area, which is a large part of Egypt, he was determined to return that land, Sinai, to Arab sovereignty. But he also understood what drove the Israelis. Okay, and he basically said in his very famous speech when he came to Jerusalem, the first Arab leader that came to visit Israel and gave the speech in the Knesset, the important was not, everybody thought, wow, the important thing is President Sadat came to Israel. That is, yes, but what was even more important is the content of the speech. Sadat was a content maker, and he gave a speech in which he basically said that in my words, he said, I, President Sadat, understand and accept that you have a legitimate security concerns. Okay? Now, until now, you've tried to address these security concerns at our expense, which is to say, by controlling land that belongs to us in this case, Egypt. Okay? Having accepted the fact that you are actually striving for your security, I came here to enter a conversation with you, the Israelis. How can we address your legitimate security concerns in ways that are not at our expense? Okay, so here again, the important thing was that Sadat accepted, a core pillar, you could wish, of the Israeli narrative, which is Israel is not driven by a desire to expand. Israel is driven by a quest for security, and however Israel accepted Sadat, and the result of all of that was that Israel returned to Egypt every square inch
of the
Sinai Peninsula, because it accepted that Sadat was earnest in saying, we understand you. Okay, we understand your quest for security, but we insist that that will be addressed not by holding, our territory, and that essentially explains the Israeli compromises that allowed this peace not only to be concluded in 1979, but to be resilient to all the efforts to undermine it until this very day, with all the changes and all the wars and the region as we've seen it since October 7 in the last almost 3 years. Still, the Egyptian-Israeli peace is both sides are committed to that peace.
Want to talk about the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty. So Israel did give Sinai back to Egypt, and because of that, Sadat was kind of seen as a hypocrite. So why was this peace treaty hugely controversial in the Arab world? I mean, it even led to his assassination, I believe, correct?
Well, the reason why is because, again, it was a diversion from the Arab narrative. And the Arab narrative, which is to say the idea that, Israel is an expansionist entity, was actually, had huge support in the Arab world. And Egypt, was seen as the largest country in terms of population and territory and so on and so forth. And President Nasser was the father of Pan-Arabism, which is to say, again, the Arab nationalism, not necessarily Egyptian nationalism. Sadat comes and says, okay, we've been at it now for 2 or 3 decades, right? That didn't, first of all, that cost us casualties and so on and so forth, cost us territories and so on. So essentially, you could say the big diversion of Sadat was he said Egypt first, okay, and he said first and foremost, I'm committed to Egyptian nationalism, and Israel threatened Egyptian nationalism by controlling the Sinai. Now, so all the other Arab countries saw what Sadat did. I don't think the word hypocrisy is really relevant there. What the word that they really used was betrayal. I mean, okay. They saw him as betraying the wider, broader Arab cause.
Arab world. Okay.
Yeah. And for that reason, they punished Egypt by essentially expelling it from the Arab League and the Arab League's headquarters, because Egypt is the largest, most populous Arab country.
Yes.
It's been in Cairo, okay, and the Arab League was transferred out of Cairo to, I think it was Tunis or some other location, and so Egypt. But you see, it didn't really. If you think about it, this is 1979. 1979 is where Sadat's overture to Israel in 1977 culminated in the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty that President Jimmy Carter was a key to negotiating. But as early as 1981, which is only like 2 years later, the Saudis, who joined the Arab consensus that to punish Egypt for what Sadat did, came for with their first peace initiative. Of course, it didn't travel very far, but it was still and then you go 10 years later, from 1981 to 1991 was the Madrid Conference. The Madrid Conference brought, key Arab countries to an international conference that was defined as intended to bring Middle East peace, which is to say peace between Arab countries and Israel.
And
Egypt at that point was co-sponsoring, together with President Mubarak, joined President Clinton, President Bush, and Jim Baker in sponsoring the Madrid Conference. And so what you could see is nobody admitted in the Arab world that they made a mistake in punishing Egypt for what it did. But the reality is that the Madrid conference was a broad, you could say, confession that Egypt was on the right track. And the same Arab world that punished Egypt in 1979, but by 1991 in Madrid, it basically admitted that what Sadat did was correct, and it began to take the region in that direction. And that's essentially, with ups and downs, with a lot of eruptions of violence, that continues to this very day. I mean, again, another major breakthrough was during President Trump's first term,
Yes.
when the Trump administration and the president and his son-in-law played a major role in negotiating the so-called Abraham Accords. So first you had peace with Egypt, and then in 1994 peace with Jordan, and then all of a sudden in 2020, three important Arab countries, four Arab countries, but three really important Arab countries, essentially joined the peace camp. Whether it's the Arab Emirates or Bahrain or Morocco, also Sudan, but not as important as the first three.
Yes.
Basically signed peace and normalization agreements with Israel.
And I want to take a little pivot here away from 1967 and the aftermath of that war, and more talk about the independence of Israel. So the British, they kind of drew up the 1947 partition plan, right? And the Jews accepted it and declared independence. But Arabs throughout the region saw the UN plan as more European colonialism, trying to just steal their land. Is that maybe why Arab states who recently just won independence themselves in the Arab Revolt, as you were saying, is that why they declared war on Israel?
I think they declared war in Israel for various reasons.
Mm-hmm.
I think that eventually, again, they joined the quest for nationalism, in their case, Arab nationalism, and they saw the incoming immigration, especially in the 1930s, but also immediately after the end of the Second World War, where the survivors of the Holocaust tried to make their way to Palestine. These were European Jews who brought education and science, what eventually becomes technology, as a threat. And the fact is that those efforts to somehow, because there were efforts, including by the British, to find a solution to this problem that would minimize the extent to which it would be a threat to the Arabs. In 1937, they created a commission headed by a member of the House of Lords, Lord Peel, that was called the Peel Commission Report. And the Peel Commission Report actually was the first introduction of the concept of a two-state solution, except that the Jewish state under the Peel Commission was tiny. But the Arabs still rejected it completely, because their feeling was that any Jewish state would eventually expand and threaten them. And the result was that the Arabs said no. The British offered the plan. The Zionist movement basically said, okay, we don't like it. It's tiny, but we'll accept it as a basis for negotiations, because of the context. The context is 1937. Nazis came to power in 1933. Jewish communities in Europe felt increasingly threatened by the Nazis, and the Zionist movement said, will accept any state, any size of a state, as long as it's a state. What does it mean to be a state? It means to be sovereign. And the most important aspect of sovereignty is that it will have control over immigration. It will not allow the British or any other factor to limit Jews' ability to escape Europe that is coming under the threat to immigrate to Palestine and so on and so forth. Now, the problem was that, and there was a sequence of conferences that the British put together with Arab leaders and so on. They all rejected it. So what happened is that, and then gradually, because of the threat that increased, now you have 1947, the partition plan now promises the Jews a state that's slightly larger than was offered 10 years earlier, because you had 250,000 displaced people, that Holocaust survivors, that had there would have to be a solution to them. That's the British and the American influence. Post World War II, America becomes more influential. Okay.
And what did the British promise the Palestinians during the 1947 partition plan?
An Arab state, but it was not called the Palestinian state. It was called the Arab state. That's the reason why there was an added conflict here, and the added conflict was between the Palestinians and Jordan, Transjordan. Okay, because the king of Jordan saw whatever part of the land would be allotted to an Arab state. And again, if you go back to 1947, the term Palestinian state doesn't exist there. It's an Arab state. It's a partition between a Jewish state and an Arab state. But Jordan, the king of Jordan, for all kinds of reasons that they require 2 weeks of discussion, saw this as potentially allowing Jordan to expand. And so he actually to some extent quietly, in all kinds of discussions that took place in the 1940s, saw the possibility of a coexistence between Jordan and a Jewish state. But that assumed, of course, that the West Bank would be annexed to Jordan. Now, that's how the 1948 war ended, because the war ended with Jordan having control over the West Bank. But it became, but this was, again, it was after already 20 years of Palestinian nationalism developing. So now you have.
And actually, I want to talk, how did the 1948 war shape Israeli and Palestinian national identities? Because you see the Palestinian state being referred to as an Arab state, and like you said, they were annexed by Jordan west of the river, so west of the West Bank was annexed. So they weren't just discriminating against Israel, they were kind of discriminating against the Palestinian National Authority too.
Yeah, in the first, I would say, first post, we gave it a term, the term Arabization. The conflict in the territory itself of Palestine at that point was a kind of a civil war. A civil war, maybe it was uncivil, but it was a war between Jews of Palestine, Zionists, and Arabs who reside in Palestine. But in 1947, again, parallel to these international developments, the end of the Second World War, the partition plan of the UN, and so on and so forth, Arab states judged that the Palestinians were too weak to actually become, let's say, a counter force to Zionists. So there was, again, now this separate national movements caring more about Jordan than about the Arab cause, caring more about Egypt than about the Arab cause. Syria, the same, okay? So what you have is Jordan takes control over the West Bank, okay? And in a way, it de-Palestinianized the West Bank, okay? It creates a situation where Palestinians residing in the West Bank are the subject of Jordan, which means that if there will be elections, they would elect the parliament in Jordan eventually. Egypt has acquired control over Gaza during this period. This is a period of Egyptian administration, which continues between the end of the 1948 war, which is early 1949, and 1967 war. During those 20 years, Gaza is subject to Egyptian administration. And then we have in the north a different situation, because in the north, some of the areas that were allotted by the partition plan to Israel were actually controlled at the end of the war by Syria. And this is an area where Israel did not expand in 1949. In the contrary, the Syrians ended the war because they were militarily more successful, you could say, than the Jordanians and the Egyptians. Some of the territory that was allotted to the Israeli state ended up in Syrian control. And then there were negotiations, and the result of these negotiations on an armistice agreement between Israel and Syria is that Syria agreed to withdraw from those territories that was originally allotted to Israel, as long as that territory remained demilitarized, so that Israel will not send its army into those areas that the Syrians withdrew from. But then there was conflict over the next years between Israel and Syria around these demilitarized zones and so on. So what you have is Arab countries taking care of their own interests, whether it's Jordan in the West Bank, Egypt in Gaza, Syria under the Golan, and so on and so forth.
Okay. And I want to kind of take a shift here and talk about the Palestinian liberation movement. So why did the PLO believed armed struggle was necessary against the Israelis and Arabs?
For two reasons. One is because they believed that what was taken, in their view, by force will only be, let's say, regained
by force.
By Palestinians by force. That's one reason. Second is it's the historic. You could say, just like anti-Semitism and Holocaust inspired Zionism, the rise of one cannot understand the rise of the PLO in the mid-1960s without observing the fact that this is a period where you begin, the focus of the internet, of, say the US, for example, shifts during this period. In which international conflict is the US, begins to be immersed in 1966, 67, 68. This is the period of the rise of the PLO. But America is in Vietnam. And so the PLO is inspired now by two already historical experiences. One is the success of the FLN in Algeria against the French. Now you have the Viet Cong
in North Vietnam, yeah.
In Vietnam, not only just in the north, but in the south as well, struggling against American occupation in Vietnam, and then it becomes, President Johnson, because of the war, decides not to run after the Democratic Party convention in Chicago in 1968. The summer of 1968 in America is called the Vietnam Summer. Okay. So for Arab nationalists, or here in this case Palestinian nationalists, the example of what's going on in Vietnam was an inspiration. Now, this is also, by the way, the mistake, because the analogy to Vietnam was a core mistake, in my view, that took years for the Arabs to understand that neither the French example nor the Vietnam example was actually relevant to the Middle East. Now, why wasn't it relevant to the Middle East? Because when the Arabs revolted in Algeria against the French, they did not threaten France. They only disputed the French occupation of Algeria. And the Viet Cong had no quarrel with America. Okay, they just basically said, we are going to fight you as long as you're here in Vietnam. Okay? You gotta go home. Okay.
But eventually we see the PLO's goals changing, right? So they later said that they would accept dividing the land between Israel and Palestine.
Yes.
So why did the conflict continue?
Because, first of all, and you asked me about the 1960s. Now, remember that what I just said a few minutes ago is relevant to the 1960s. It takes 20 years to essentially de facto accept the idea of a Palestinian state residing side by side with Israel. This is only in 1988. So it's almost 20 years that it took for them to understand that they're in this paradox, that as long as they threaten Israel, they say Palestinian state as a substitute, right, to Israel. Okay, the PLO's original covenant looked at, stated that the state of Israel was null and void. Okay, so this is as if the FLN had a claim on France. It is as if the Viet Cong had a claim on America, which they didn't. And because they had a claim on Israel, okay, the Israelis felt that they didn't have the option that the French had, which is to go back to France, or that the Americans had, which is to go back to America. The Israelis have nowhere to go back to. Okay, so for Israel, this still was an existential threat, which meant the Israelis were highly, highly motivated to resist. But it took 20 years, and the Palestinians finally understood that they have to create somehow a situation that would be more reminiscent to the Algerians versus the French and the Viet Cong versus the States by saying, okay, we are no longer struggling to destroy the state of Israel. Okay, we're struggling to create a state that would live side by side with Israel. That's what happened in 1988. Still took 5 years from 1988, from that very important transition, to the Oslo Accords that began this process of trying to build a Palestinian state.
And in between those times, in the late 1980s, I believe, this Palestinian frustration, it kind of exploded into the Intifada, which is an Arabic word for uprising. Right. So can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that because you had stagnation, nobody came to the Palestinians' assistance. Nobody came to substitute for the Palestinians. Remember that by the time of the Intifada, which is late 1980, actually December 1987, and then 1988, 1989, the peace between Israel and Egypt had already existed for 10 years. Okay, so the Arab option, which is to say that the Arab states would unite to fight Israel for the Palestinians, was gone.
It's slim, yeah.
Because Egypt was the largest and most robust Arab country, and they took themselves out of the potential war coalition, which is the reason why, when it happened in 1977, 78, 79, the Arab states saw it as a betrayal. The Palestinians clearly understood that the military option, which is to say to decide the conflict by force, is no longer a viable now, and definitely after. So they were very frustrated. There is what happens is that a few months before the Intifada erupted in late 1987, there were two important developments. One is King Hussein of Jordan took Jordan out of the discussions of the future of the West Bank. He basically said, okay, You don't want us the Jordanians. You is the Palestinians. You don't want us. You want to be independent. Okay, fine. We're getting out of this mess. It's your business. Okay. So first of all, the Jordanians took themselves out of the story, and then what happened is that there was an Arab League meeting, and the Arab League is like almost the United Nations of the Arab world. So they have summits, meetings, political decisions, and so on. One of these Arab meetings, Arab summits, took place before the Intifada erupted, and it was the first time that the Arab League final decisions at the end of the summit didn't even mention the Palestinian issue. So the Palestinians felt that they were ignored, and so the natural thing was to protest. And this was actually a very popular protest. It was not like the second Intifada, which was much more violent years later, but done by a small number of people. The first Intifada was in every town, in every city, in the West Bank, and so on, because it was really a natural, you could say, popular uprising, not necessarily organized, not necessarily led, but a natural, reaction to the fact that we have this problem, we're being occupied, and our natural allies are abandoning us because they have their interests first, which is, again, the Arab states and so on. So that explains the eruption. And this is why this Intifada began and led, to the extent that it was led, by the population itself. It wasn't.
And is this when we kind of see Hamas rising through those kind of popular protests?
Yeah, Hamas rises because remember that the Fatah leadership,
Mm-hmm.
which were essentially, let's say, the relatively secular nationalists, they were in exile. After
the ceasefire in southern Lebanon was shattered today by the sound of guns, bombs, and flames.
The end of the Lebanon War, one of the most important one of the two most important consequences of the Lebanon War in 1982 was essentially that Fatah leadership was exiled to Tunis, which made them geographically even farther from the territory that is in dispute. So to an extent, and because they were farther, they seemed to be less relevant, and so to an extent, the popular uprising of the first Intifada was not just an Intifada against Israel. It was also, to an extent, an Intifada against the Palestinian leadership that was in Tunis, because it was farther away. The population felt that it was consumed by its own survival. It didn't radiate involvement and care for the Palestinians themselves in the West Bank. So the Palestinians in the West Bank, so basically the popular uprising was a statement that said, number one, we're not going to accept occupation, but at the same time, we have given up on the formal leadership that is now in exile for saving us. Okay, so we are going to take matters into our own hands. So to some extent, it was a reaction to Israel. It was also a reaction to the leadership in Tunis, which actually then entered into the calculation of Arafat 2 or 3 years later to accept the compromise that he had to accept in the Oslo Accords, because he also understood that he has to make himself relevant again. And since they couldn't fight a war from the distance of Tunis, the only alternative to the PLO was diplomacy. And so now you have, again, this process. It begins in 1988 with the Declaration of Independence and the de facto acceptance of a two-state solution. This is, again, by the PLO that's already in Tunis. Okay? And then all the way these 5 years from 1988 to the Oslo Accords, where Arafat becomes relevant again because of the compromise that he made.
Are we facing kind of another regional war that will kind of draw in Hamas's allies this time, like Hezbollah in Lebanon and Iran? Or does this like kind of latest episode of ultra-violence paradoxically kind of present us with an opportunity for peace by focusing on the minds of more sensible leaders in Israel among the Palestinians?
The only honest answer that I have to your question is, we don't know. It's too early to tell.
Mm-hmm.
I will only give an example of a period that is very different from our period, but it begs exactly the question that you raised, and that is the period of Madrid comes after the Gulf War, the first Gulf War.
Okay. So after Iraq.
So exactly. So the first Gulf War. This is, first of all, we have to accept this is a period that was a period. Madrid was essentially the entail of a period that was very, very, very violent in the Middle East. Okay. Because to this very day, including everything that's happened after October 7, the most destructive war that we've had in the Middle East was the war between Iraq and Iran, 1988. So first of all, you have a very, very, very violent period of 8 years, of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of casualties, and so on and so forth. Then Saddam, for all kinds of reasons we won't get into because it takes another 2 weeks, invades Kuwait, right?
Okay.
And the U.S. creates a coalition which includes key Arab countries. We sometimes forget that not only Egypt, which is kind of more understandable given the fact that since the aftermath of the 73 war, Egypt and the U.S. became much closer. But that coalition, including Syria was in the U.S.-led coalition to defeat Saddam and caused Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait. Okay. Mm-hmm. So now what's the result of all of this? Number one, you have the Madrid Conference. Number two, you have Israeli-Jordanian-Palestinian negotiations, which ultimately lead to the Oslo Accords. Okay. Then in 1994, you have the Israeli-Jordanian peace. Okay. So this period of extreme violence creates it's actually almost like a golden era for peace. You have the most important regional conference, Madrid, that's brought together to establish peace in the Middle East. The Madrid conference was also followed by something called the multilateral talks. So this is Israel and 13 Arab countries, 13 Arab countries, and the Palestinians sitting and dealing with the regional problems, which is refugees, economic development, environmental issues, and arms control and regional security. So this is unprecedented. Not only was this a formal conference in Madrid, and these talks continued for like 2 or 3 years, which is why I call this period the golden period. Okay, and all this came on the wings of the most devastating period in Middle East relations and so on and so forth. So this is why I think that your question is very, very valid, because we already had one experience of huge violence leading to peace negotiations. And I certainly would be the last person to exclude the possibility that eventually out of this mess that we see right now, and it is a huge mess, if you look at the situation in terms of what is happening now, let's just take the last few days between Iran and a number of Arab countries, right? The Iranians are reacting to U.S. insistence that the Straits of Hormuz have to be open as an international route. And who are they reacting against? I mean, who are they shooting at? At Kuwait, at Bahrain, and so on. It's in previous periods, people would have said this is insane, this can't happen, but it's now happening. So the question is this: is it possible that after we have this, this period will run out, just like the Gulf War ran out? Is it possible that leaders in the region would reach the conclusion that something fundamental has to change here? The relationship between the parties have to change here, and that means all parties. Just like before Sadat came to Israel, the idea that the president of Egypt will come to Israel and give a speech to the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, and through it to the Israeli population. If you said that's possible, say even as 2 years earlier, okay, you would be sent to the nearest,
mental
psychiatric asylum, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what is now seen as absolutely impossible, that, for example, this leadership of Iran would reach the conclusion that the path itself is devastating and that the path has to be rethought. Right now it seems like a dream. Right now it seems everybody is so far away from it. Right now it's basically everybody's trying to show their muscles. Whether it's drone muscles or other kinds of muscles, and so on and so forth. And to conceive of a possibility that somebody would reach the conclusion that this will only bring greater devastation, and that the fundamentals have to be rethought. It looks like a dream, but it looked like a dream in the Israeli-Egyptian case. It looked like a dream before the Madrid conference was convened. The idea that Israel would reach an agreement called the Oslo Accords with an organization that Israel saw as a terrorist organization, period, was could be easily dismissed as
We are putting a complete siege on Gaza. No electricity, no food, no water, no gas, it's all closed. We're fighting animals and are acting accordingly.
Dream walking. And it's happened. So I think it can happen again.
And speaking of it happening again, assuming that the ongoing land operation in Gaza is successful and Israel is able to deal or to eradicate Hamas's governing and military capacity, then what substitutes? Like, what comes next? How does Israel avoid anarchy in the region?
Only, in my own view, by allowing Hamas to be substituted by a variation of what internationally has been recognized as the legitimate leadership of the Palestinian people, which is the Palestinian Authority, headquartered in Gaza, in Ramallah. But of course there is also a broad recognition, because of issues of failure and economic and complete corruption and incompetence, that leadership is currently seen by Palestinians in every survey as illegitimate. So that means that the Palestinian current leadership that is located in Ramallah has to go through a reinvention. It has to get rid of the corruption. The leadership is too old. It's been around too much. Younger leadership, more energetic, less corrupt, has to substitute it to be able to be seen by Palestinians. Forget about Israelis and Europeans and so on and so forth. It has to have a leadership that is seen by Palestinians as legitimate. That is, some people say, that will require elections, which the current leadership has avoided now for 14 years, to create, again, and to, let's say, encourage young people to be willing to roll up their sleeves and enter into what we regard as politics. And that's not easy. And that hasn't happened yet. But there are two things that we have to remember. One is there are elections which will be held in Israel in late October, and hopefully will bring a new crop of leaders in Israel that will rethink these issues and think about what Israel can do to make a change on the Palestinian side easier. That's on the Israeli side. But also on the Palestinian side, their current leader that has postponed every election in the last 14 years is almost 90 years old. So
but couldn't that also be because they're scared of Hamas coming into power again?
President Abbas is certainly, yes. The answer to your question is yes, because his memory is that Hamas won the 2006 elections. It's 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So again, because he reads, he doesn't like what he reads in public opinion polls, but he can't completely ignore them. He sees how the public perceives himself as illegitimate and his party as illegitimate, and so on. I don't think that he's going to change because it's too late. So then the next question is, will a younger leadership from his movement, rise up and say, this is impossible. We can't continue. We have to present, which is again the remnants of the nationalist, the secular leadership, and so on and so forth. Among the Palestinians, they have to present let's say an alternative that would be truly competitive to Hamas. Nobody can do it for them. You can't invent a leadership for another society.
Yeah.
The leadership has to come from the society itself. And just as the Israelis have to make up their minds, and we will see whether they have or haven't in the elections, which are, Israel has a different political system. It can't postpone elections in the way that they've been postponed on the Palestinian side. They have to be, unless there is a regional war, elections will take place during the last 10 days of October. And
so one of the implications, I think, of the proposal that you put forward is that Hamas can be rooted out and defeated and replaced with the PA. Now, if I were a more cynical person, I would say, wow, this is a great proposal, but we're going to get these countries which can barely govern themselves to try and establish governance in Gaza by installing an organization. That kind of seems like it would fail. And I endorse your moral assessment of Hamas, but the question is Hamas Al-Qaeda or is Hamas the Taliban? Because if Hamas is Al-Qaeda, you can just flick them off, but if they're the Taliban, they'll keep coming back because they're kind of deeply rooted in that society. So what do you think about this proposal and the assumption that it underlies it about the nation of Hamas?
That's a very, very good question. And here is my answer. You cannot get rid of Hamas as an idea.
Okay.
this is political Islam. Hamas is political Islam. And the idea, and you cannot, and especially you can't from the outside do that. You can't do that. Israel can't do it. I'm not sure that I mean, look, the most important neighbor to this question, other than Israel, is Egypt. Okay, Egypt did not get rid of the Muslim Brothers. They pushed them out of power. They pushed them out of government. Okay, but the Muslim Brothers as an idea still remains. So the idea, in my own view, is that there'll be some kind of a magic formula that would resolve, that would essentially take Hamas completely out of the equation is an illusion, because you're absolutely right. Hamas is a popular movement. By the way, also Hezbollah is a popular movement.
In Lebanon?
In Lebanon, both of them are not Al Qaeda. But again, so if you want reasons to be pessimistic, there are many reasons to be pessimistic. But at the same time, we have to observe, for example, what happened in Syria. Okay, in Syria you have a guy who was an Al Qaeda senior guy, right?
Yeah.
And look at what happened. He took over Syria with, by the way, very few casualties, right? This was not a very violent takeover, to be honest. Now, he's the guy that the President of the United States sees as a potential partner, right?
Yeah.
He's enamored. So all this is to say, look, there are strange bedfellows, there are strange developments. Most of those strange developments are difficult to predict. But to me, again, if you look at it from the point of view, look, if you're a national leader, and especially if you're focused on security, which I have in most of my professional life, then your focus is threats. And how do you address the threats? If you're a businessman, you don't think in those terms. You look for opportunities. Okay? That actually is, one dimension of the gap between, say, President Trump and other leaders in the Middle East, including Israeli leaders, because he's a businessman. So he's constantly looking for. So even President Shara of Syria, a former Al Qaeda guy, for different reasons, he is seen by the President of the United States as an opportunity. Okay. So all this is only to say one thing, which is stranger things already have happened. They can happen again. They would always be different. They would not be a repetition of other examples. They would be different. But there are examples of positive changes. Sadat is one kind of a positive change. So, we should hope for more Arab leaders being willing to follow this. And it's not a simple region.
Yeah. So, final question. So we have 4 parties here. We have the government of the State of Israel, we have Hamas, we have the PA, and we have the Arab states. So the PA you want to bring back out of the closet, and actually I feel none of the 4 are qualified to get us peace. Hamas, by virtue of its charter, if we're going to take it seriously, is utterly uninterested in peace, and the PA is kind of a failure right now and needs to be restructured, and the State of Israel's government, it's about to be restructured after this October election. So how can you still have any kind of optimism about this, Professor Shai?
Because I think, and this is why I think, so the question is, again, going back to this issue of what exactly explains the golden era that I mentioned about earlier, okay? The golden era of the early 90s. It brought about Madrid, it brought about the peace with Jordan, it brought about the Oslo Accords, and so on and so forth. What happened was a kind of a broad consensus that something major has to change, for otherwise all what we will see is death and destruction. Okay? And again, I remind again and again and again that the source of that change is just what happened during the previous 10 years. The fact that the Iran-Iraq war was the slaughter that it was, okay? The fact that the invasion of Kuwait was what it was, and so on and so forth, had led leaders in the region and people in the region to understand that they have to conduct business differently than they have. So now we've got post-October 7 with whatever happened in Gaza, called the Gaza War. And now this expansion of this to a regional war. And now you see that what the consequences of that in terms of, nobody, I can guarantee you, very, very few people in the US would have said 5 years ago, it's possible that something will happen in this little point on the earth called Straits of Hormuz, and that will affect the price of gasoline in the Midwest of America, right? How many people would have said that's a likely outcome? No, but now they see it. They see it every time they drive by the gas station, even if they don't enter the gas station, they see the consequence. They see the fact that this world is not, there are interconnections between different parts of the world. And the conclusion from that is that we don't have the luxury of saying, okay, they'll kill each other over there, we can continue our lives. That was exactly what brought the Madrid conference. The President of the United States, the Secretary of State, and so on and so forth, working very carefully to make sure that all the leaders in the region show up. First of all, that they show up. Why? Because they understood that the world cannot afford to continue business as usual. Business as usual brought hundreds of thousands of deaths during that period. And there has to be a consensus. And there has to be leadership. Leadership means that, as you mentioned Sadat, assassination. Rabin was assassinated, okay? The peacemakers take a risk. But not making peace is also a huge risk. And so why am I optimistic? Is because I've seen this in the past. It will not be a repeat of the past. It will be a variation, but it has to be, because otherwise we kind of have to say, okay, whatever comes. Tens of thousands of people were killed after October 7. We have to get used to the fact that this will happen again. No, I'm not willing to accept that. I mean, I think the Middle East, people who live in the Middle East deserve to have a normal life.
The more you study this conflict, the more you realize there are no easy villains and no easy heroes. There's fear, there's trauma, there's injustice, and there are generations of people who have grown up knowing nothing but conflict. And yet history also shows something else. That conflicts that once seemed permanent can eventually end, not because hatred disappears, but because people decide that alternatives have become even worse. Whether Israel and Palestine are approaching that moment or moving further away from it, may be one of the defining questions of our time. So I would like to say to Professor Shai Feldman, thank you so much for helping us think through one of the most difficult and consequential conflicts of the world. And to everyone watching, thank you for joining us. And if you enjoyed this conversation, please consider subscribing, because these are the kinds of discussions that help us move beyond slogans and better understand the forces shaping our world. One more time, Professor Shai, thank you so much.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Dia. It's an idea that we maps around it. It's completely